So no matter what side you're on, we've still got to listen. We've still got to pay respect to the other side. And listen with respect.
To be open and truthful and respectful, I think it's good to give you at least a short glimpse of how we will vote, why we will vote, and what we've learned from listening to the First Peoples in this country. Tim, would you like to start?
Sure. Thank you, Geoff. And my thoughts about this start with the word recognition. To recognise someone, you need to know something about how those who you wish to recognise see themselves. There is no point offering recognition unless you know what form of recognition will satisfy their desire to be recognised. If we don't know how Indigenous Australians wish to be recognised, then our offer to recognise them, however well-intentioned, will fail. Those doing the recognising, in this case non-Indigenous Australians, have to ask Indigenous Australians what form they want recognition to take. Indigenous Australians have told us what form of recognition they want. They have told us that they want the Australian Constitution to be amended so that it provides for the existence of an Indigenous advisory body, a voice to the Executive and to Parliament. If we are genuine in our desire to recognise Indigenous Australians in the Constitution, we cannot ignore their clear statement of the form of recognition that they desire. After several years of nationwide debate about possible terms of recognition, Indigenous Australians issued the Uluru Statement from the Heart in May 2017. It made clear that a constitutionally entrenched voice is the form of recognition that they desire. There are people on the no side who claim that they are in favour of recognising Indigenous Australians in Australia's Constitution. Their position is absurd and illogical. They fail to understand that to deny Indigenous Australians the recognition that they say they want is to fail to recognise them. People on the no side would be more consistent, more honest, if they admitted that by objecting to putting the voice in the Constitution, they are refusing to recognise. It is an absurdity for the No campaign to say, we want to recognise you in the Australian Constitution, but we insist on telling you what form that recognition will take. We insist on recognising you in our terms, and we refuse your terms. That is not recognition, that is paternalism. So how can we be sure that we know that Indigenous Australians want the voice as the form of recognition? The process of consultation that led to the issuing of the Uluru Statement from the Heart was unprecedented. Never before have so many Indigenous Australians assembled in a series of regional meetings over many months to debate the options for constitutional recognition. The regional dialogues and the National Assembly that climaxed those dialogues was the work of democracy. The work of democracy is difficult. When Indigenous Australians succeed in it, as they did at Uluru, we had better take seriously the statement of Indigenous wishes that issued from Uluru. The Uluru Statement from the Heart should command our respect and admiration. To tell the authors of that statement that they are asking for the wrong thing is to deny recognition.
Thank you so much, Geoff. Look, can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging.
I must have been a very strange child. When I was 10 years old, most 10-year-olds are asking for a cricket bat or a bike, maybe the latest game for their birthday. I was a bit old. I said to my parents, I'd like a copy of the Australian Constitution. I've described myself as nervous Maximus for having wanted such a document. I was doing a schoolboy project on Australia's Prime Ministers, and I kept reading about this Constitution thing that was there, and I wanted to see what it was. It's not much of a page turner. The Constitution is something that we should all be very proud of. In fact, gathering here tonight to talk about constitutional change connects us very much with the people who sat around in halls like this in the 1890s and debated our Constitution. I come from the tradition that says we've got a really great Constitution. We're one of the oldest continuous democracies in the world. Our Constitution was written in Australia by Australians and for Australian conditions, and in a rarity at that time, and still in a rarity today, it was voted on by Australians at that time, which is really quite amazing. What the Founding Fathers did in the 1890s is they got together the constituent parts of Australia. They got together the 6 colonies, and they worked out how they could set aside their differences and become one people. Unfortunately, there was one group of people, the part of the constituent parts of Australia, that they left out, and that was Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. And so there's always been, despite our excellent Constitution, there's always been a part of our Constitution that's been missing. With this referendum, we will complete our Constitution and complete the work that was begun by the Founding Fathers in the 1890s, in my view. And I think it's such an important referendum. I want to talk a little bit about what it is that we are and are not voting on, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. If you listen to the No case, we're voting about the Western Australian heritage laws. We're voting about treaties. We're voting about welcome to country. I'm surprised they haven't told us we're voting about dot paintings as well. I mean, anything and everything they have thrown at this. I've described their approach as the Jackson Pollock approach to politics. You know, Jackson Pollock loopholes. Splat, 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 splat. That's the approach of the No case here. I always think the truth will set you free. And one of the most important things we can do is to have a look at the bit of paper that I put on your chair. And what I want you to do is I want you to turn this bit of paper, take it home with you, make some copies of it, turn it into placemats at your dinner party, start to have a conversation, hand it out to your friends, because this is what we're voting on. And I just want to go through it because I think it's actually really important. It's the single most important thing that I'm going to say tonight. So what you'll see on this piece of paper is the referendum question. A proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve of this proposed alteration? They are the words that will appear on your ballot paper, no other words. And there's a box on the ballot paper where you have to write the word yes if you approve of the change and no if you disapprove. Simple as that. Now, the amendment itself appears below that. Some of my friends on the No campaign have said that this is the biggest change to our Constitution in history. Now, I come from a tradition, as I say, where I think we have a good Constitution, so most of the time you'll find me on the No case for a referendum. And indeed, in 1999, I was on the No case for the Republic referendum. That was a big change to our Constitution. The Republic brought about 69 separate changes to our Constitution. By contrast, this is one of the smallest changes to our Constitution. We're talking about one new section. That's all this is. So let's read what it says. In recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the First Peoples of Australia. That's the recognition part that we've all been talking about since the days of that great Yorta man, William Cooper, who sought the recognition of these people when he petitioned the King. 1. There shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. That's the new committee that we're setting up, and that gives this new committee, called the Voice, a permanent place in our Constitution. 2. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice may make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government of the Commonwealth. The Executive Government of the Commonwealth is just a fancy way of saying public servants and ministers on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So what's the job of this new committee? It's to make representations to Parliament, public service and ministers about matters affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It's a chance for us as parliamentarians to listen to Aboriginal people in order to do something to close the gap in education, employment, healthcare and housing. You know, I like to say Australia's an amazing country. We're at the top of the world for every imaginable social and economic indicator. But there's a gap between the performance of the rest of the community and Aboriginal people that is not closing, Doesn't matter who's in government, doesn't matter how much money you throw at it, doesn't matter how much goodwill or bipartisan support is there, we need structural change. Number 3, this is the important part because it reminds us that the Parliament is supreme. The Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures. So this is where the Parliament will come up with the detail. So what's the amendment doing? Number 1, it's recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Number 2, it's creating a new committee that's going to be put into the Constitution so we can listen to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the policies and laws that affect them. Number 3, this is an advisory committee. We, the Parliament, your elected representatives, remain supreme because we can adjust what this body does over time to adapt to changing circumstances. So if it starts and it's not doing the right thing, we can reform it. What we can't do, which has happened previously, is abolish it. We've got to have a body, we've got to allow it to make representations. But how it makes its representations is a matter for the Parliament. And just to put this in a way that is easy for us all to relate to in our own lives, this constitutional law is a tough topic, and what happens in remote communities or even in Canberra is a long way away. I want you to think about the local progress associations that exist here on the northern beaches. Organisations like the Palm Beach Whale Beach Progress Association or the Avalon Progress Association. What do these organisations do? Every year they have an AGM and they elect people as part of the AGM. They are sort of the local voice, if you like. From time to time, they will make representations to your council about development matters that occur in your area. Often they'll be saying, we don't like the way that the area is changing, we don't like what's happening with the new developments. The council listens to those representations. Sometimes the council adopts them. Sometimes the council rejects them. And other times the council will cherry pick ideas. Whether the council adopts, rejects or cherry picks, the fact of the presence of these community associations means that the council's decision is ultimately better because the council has listened directly to the people affected by the policy that it's going to bring in. The voice is exactly the same concept. We have in Canberra a national voice that is plugged into local and regional voices that will feed that voice from local communities up to Canberra so we can make better policies and laws, so we can address things like closing the gap to ensure that Indigenous people have a better life expectancy than they do now. The Indigenous life expectancy in this country is 8 years less than the rest of the population. The suicide rate is 2.5 times that of the rest of the population. 1 in 2 Aboriginal Australians are living at or below the poverty line. This is completely unacceptable in a nation as rich and prosperous and successful as ours. The fundamental thing that has been missing is a mechanism to ground truth the smart, well-meaning ideas that are developed in Canberra. That's what this referendum is about. This referendum is we, the Parliament, saying to the Australian people, we want your permission to crack on and set up this body. We want your permission to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution. We want you to join us and help us complete our Constitution. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Julian. This is what I mean by the search for common ground. I disagree with some of the fundamental views that Julian expressed about the Constitution and much of what he has written about the Constitution. But I totally agree with his view about what is on the table in this referendum. And I will vote yes in the referendum because I am convinced that it will strengthen our government and strengthen our nation. It will put into the Constitution for the first time a missing foundation stone. The recognition of the world's oldest continuous cultures has been missing from the document that defines who we are in our own eyes and how the world sees us. That mix of high culture, of languages, of diverse cultural practice, even of sport and music and dance that is part of the heritage offered to us through this recognition, will make us a stronger nation, a more united nation. It will in fact give us the foundations of the ancient diversity of culture here to become the foundations of the most hopeful 21st century society that I can see on this earth. In addition, the voice as a mechanism can empower government itself to make the changes that it has failed to make. John Howard, a champion of your party, said on the front pages of The Australian just 2 weeks ago, the reason the whole sector of Aboriginal development has failed is because, I quote, government is not good in this area. Although John Howard is an opponent and a fierce one against the voice and of this particular offering in this referendum, he has told the truth about why we are failing as a nation to close any of those dreaded gaps that year after year I have often gone to Canberra and stood with Julian's colleagues as some poor minister from Ken White and all of those before him had to recite the litany of failures. The truth is, government has failed to listen, and the voice is a hopeful offering to breathe some life and light into that space, and perhaps to enhance the power of First Peoples to get those who have not listened to deeply consider the advice that is given to them. The Productivity Commission, which is an independent agency, has tried to focus us during this referendum simply on the facts. As Tim mentioned, you can get lost in misinformation. Julian has said we could spend the entire evening dealing with things, even in this election pamphlet. I counted 13 outright lies on one single page. I don't mean distortions, I mean lies. So, because we can't easily clean up that, the Australian Electoral Commission can't, we are going to rely on our democratic process to do as Neil urged at the start, to try to be honest and respectful, to listen to the naysayers, those who are yes, no, and everything in between, and then try and arrive at those facts. But please keep in mind what that Productivity Commission's latest advice to the government, to Australia was. They said we need a watchdog with teeth. That is how they see the voice mechanism. An agency to give agency to Aboriginal voices, to be able to be a watchdog with teeth. The independent assessors who are really auditing the performance of government tried to focus on a handful of programs to point out things like the crime rate among young people in Alice Springs that the media whips up into a frenzy to divert attention from any of the things that have not been done that lead to that social distress and alienation and anger, and then the pattern of crime and youthful incarceration and then adult incarceration and suicide rates and imprisonment rates and incarceration rates that are all addressed in the Uluru Statement from the Heart to say the First Peoples are not criminal by nature. How have we been so silent to heed the independent advice that is given? The Productivity Commission also reminded the country just a couple of weeks ago that it was as recent as 2020 that the COAG process, federal and state governments agreed that what what we really need to move ahead on closing some of those other gaps was key advice from lived experience, from grassroots communities, from the peak bodies that have been ignored. We needed to enhance the advice because that is what is missing from the shaping of policy, from top-down solutions that have failed decade after decade, certainly right through the period that I have been a journalist. I've watched government stick at this assimilationist, paternalistic and top-down approach against the facts, despite their other watchdogs, like the Productivity Commission or the AMA or any of the medical, health and education institutes, trying to get them to actually listen to what the victims of these policies were enduring. And the truth is, they have not listened. I say the voice and a yes in this referendum could end the great Australian silence. It could be our formal recognition of really who we are, that all of us who have come in the last couple of centuries are still standing on the shoulders of the ancestors, and in recognising that we will build a stronger government, we will build a healthier and happier and more coherent way to go forward together. Tim, you have far more experience than anyone I know at actually morphing history, sociology, anthropology, but what I've really respect through your years of work is you've seen this as about a relationship. The things that are part of that great Australian silence, the relationship between the First Peoples and the rest of us. How do you think this referendum could shift and change for the better that relationship?
I'm a retired academic, and when you're a retired academic, you get asked to do things like judge prizes. And I have recently judged a prize called the Stanner Prize, named after the anthropologist W.E.H. or Bill Stanner. And it's for the best PhD student thesis written by an Indigenous person in the last 2 years. What that work has revealed to me is that there is a cohort of young Indigenous policy intellectuals coming through our universities that have the potential to lead the organisation that hopefully, the voice that we are hopefully going to create over the next few years. If you follow this issue in the news, you will see lots of mentions of some terrific Indigenous leaders, Marcia Langton, Noel Pearson. You've probably got your own list of favourites who you admire. Those people are not going to be here, or at least they're not going to be very active in 10 years' time. The voice is an investment in the harvesting of the upcoming cohort of Indigenous leaders and policy thinkers that none of you have ever heard of, I suspect. My way of answering your question, Geoff, is to just alter the timescale. The timescale we're thinking of at the moment is getting to the referendum. Think in 10 years' time, if we have this institution embedded in the Constitution, being adequately funded and attracting the brightest minds of Indigenous Australia. It will help to transform the way we govern Australia.
Julian, I would love to hear your thoughts about what is in the Constitution at this moment about the First Peoples, because we're sitting not far from where the old paddle steamer, the Lucinda, went up the Hawkesbury and around to what we now call the basin in that area. And, you know, we had 7 to 10 white men over that long Easter weekend in 1891, who fundamentally drafted the core provisions. Could you explain to us, with your fine legal mind, what is in the Constitution now, and how will those remaining provisions work if the voice succeeds in this recognition provision?
Founding Fathers was quite remarkable both in their legal learning and their commitment to public service. And by the standards of their age, and you know this from the various democratic innovations like the secret ballot, like women voting that we pioneered in this country, by the standards of their age, they were thoroughly liberal people. But I'm sure we are expressing in common discussion today views that in 50 and 100 years' time people will say, my goodness, how could they possibly have said that? That was true of the founding generation. I like to highlight that the main work that they did on the Lucinda that weekend was the judicial power of the Commonwealth, Chapter 3 of the Constitution. The other thing that I don't like to mention so much is that same weekend, Samuel Griffith, who was very concerned about the Islander Labor in Queensland, felt that the Constitution needed to have what's known as the races power, Section 51(26) of the Constitution. Griffith put that in the Constitution, and that largely survived the amendments of the Constitution that occurred in the 1897-1898 conventions. Section 51(26) said at Federation, the Commonwealth shall have power to make, Commonwealth Parliament shall have power to make laws for the people of any race for whom it's deemed necessary to make laws, excluding people of the Aboriginal race. Also, in section 127, there was a provision in the Constitution that said, in terms of the census, that Aboriginal people would not be counted. There's a third provision in the Constitution, section 25, which presupposes that some of the states would continue to have race-based laws. A little bit of history. None of this has anything to do with what we're voting on the referendum, but it's an interesting piece of history. The people who were not in Queensland and Western Australia and South Australia, so people like us in New South Wales and Victoria and Tasmania who had much smaller Aboriginal populations, were concerned that the Queenslanders, the South Australians and the West Australians would want to count the Aboriginal people in their population, even though they didn't necessarily give them the vote, in order to increase the number of members of the House of Representatives that they'd have. And that's why section 127 was put in there and section 25 was put in there. Now in 1967, this is a really remarkable thing. In 1967, 90% of Australians voted to remove that provision that said Aboriginal people would be excluded from the census and remove the exclusion in the races power of laws about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So 1967 we were giving Aboriginal people the right to be counted, as it talks about in the Uluru Statement, and also the Commonwealth Parliament the power to make laws about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. 90%. It's positively a North Korean result. It's hard to imagine Australians today would agree on the time of day. We know they don't, because Queensland doesn't have daylight saving in Western Australia, but you know, it really is a remarkable result, and it is the standout of all referenda. What's the important thing about the 1967 referendum, to go to Geoff's question about this referendum? So although we've had the races power in the Constitution since 1901, and so any argument that friends on the other side of the debate say, oh, we're adding race into the Constitution or we're dividing people by race, just isn't true. There's been race in the Constitution from day one. The racist power was never used to make laws about anyone until 1967. And since 1967, the racist power has been used to make laws about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We don't make laws about Chinese Australians, we don't make laws about Italian Australians, we don't make laws about Greek Australians or Jewish Australians or Christian Australians or Hindu Australians. But we do make laws about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. We make those laws that apply to them and them only. Every other law that's made by the Commonwealth Parliament is a law of general application to the whole community. There is those suite of laws that apply only to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Just as in the example I gave before about your local progress association, and you'd want to be consulted if a development application affected you, isn't it right that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should also be consulted about policies and laws that affect them? That's all the voice is asking to do. Because we make this one suite of laws that only applies to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, it's therefore right that they should be consulted before we make those laws. The Parliament continues to decide what laws it's going to make. But all this is adding in as a mechanism to ensure that we're actually listening to people, for the first time being mandated to listen to people before we go and legislate.
I would add, Julian, that those provisions, to my knowledge, have only been used to make laws against Aboriginal people. The Northern Territory intervention comes to mind, where clearly there was no considered recognition of the Aboriginal advice, and in the trampling of Aboriginal advice, we had really the great disruption, I would call it, which I personally believe is, along with the Soul Generations policy, the two most disastrous government interventions into the lives of First Peoples over the past couple of centuries. So while we argue for the importance of this crucial advice, I think we've got to see that federal government policy has been long assimilationist and paternalistic and damaging, and the law can be directed to discriminate against Aboriginal people with nothing in that constitution that prevents their human rights being trampled. We had special rapporteurs from the United Nations come and remind us of that. But the point is, the stain of racism, as I see it, remains on that constitution until we begin to see what government policy has done in an oppressive, discriminatory sense. That's the truth-seeking that goes along with every discussion we have on a night like this, is part of the honesty and the maturing of our nation to be able to say, this hasn't worked. John Howard was right. Government is not good in this space. But on the subject of race, I want to ask you, Tim, should we be thinking, when we discuss this with those that take the no argument, that this is inserting race into the whole process of government, that we are not really recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in terms of race at all, which is a very outdated scientific concept, as you know. There is one human race. There may be tribes and ethnic diversity. What we're really doing is seeing their status as First Peoples, which is quite a different consideration.
Yes, that's right, Geoff. I think you've answered your own question in a way. The wording of the amendment explicitly says First Peoples. It doesn't recognise Indigenous Australians as a race. One thing I might comment on, though, is that the racist power in the Constitution has not always been used in a way that was adverse to Indigenous Australians. The Native Title Act is based on the racist power, on that section of the Constitution. The Native Title Act is beneficial to Indigenous Australians. Now, so I'll use that example to make another point, that when the racist power has been exercised in a way that followed a long conversation or engagement with Indigenous Australians, it can produce legislation which is good. In other words, I would say that use of the racist power, the Native Title Act, is a very good example of the good that you can do when you are forced, as the Keating government was forced really by the High Court's decision in Mabo in 1992, when you are forced to make a law and to make a law about Indigenous people, and you are determined to make that law in a way that is actually helpful to them, what do? You then have to sit down and talk to them. And so throughout 1992 and 93, there was an unprecedented series of conversations between the Commonwealth Government and the organised Indigenous constituency, represented partly by ATSI, but by other Aboriginal leaders and organisations as well, that came up with a way of legislating this thing which the High Court said now exists, native title. So the history of the racist power furnishes us with examples of the good sense of taking notice of what Indigenous Australians are telling us.
I wanted to add something to Tim's point because I think the Native Title Act is a really great example. And indeed, when we think, and as is Geoff's about the intervention, not all laws that are made about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are made pursuant to the racist power. So the Northern Territory intervention was made actually pursuant to the Territory's power. When we think about, say, the AB study program, that was made under the benefits to students power. So you might actually ask, when you look at the second provision, this will help you explain the second provision. When friends of yours say, goodness, matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, that could be anything. We've all heard that argument. Why is it expressed so broadly? Why doesn't it just say the racist power? And that is because matters that relate to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are not confined to that narrow suite of laws that are made under the racist power. Some can be made under powers with relation to benefits to students. Many of them are made under the Territory's power. Many of them use a suite of other powers. So rather than just having it as a very narrow set of laws, of which there are only about 18, instead the idea was that it should be more flexible so that we can acknowledge that there's a range of different powers under which Aboriginal laws are made about and for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
Julian, are there any risks, as the No campaign constantly suggests, part of your Jackson Pollock metaphor, that the voice as a committee of advisors could overreach, that they could jam up government, that they could stray into areas where they are not really issues affecting the First Peoples? Are there risks, or do you accept the advice that came from Robert French, the former Chief Justice, that the great benefits far outweigh the very minor risks?
I think the risks are overstated because you look at the third paragraph there and the Parliament retains control of what the Voice does. I mean, there's the other check that's going to be on the Voice as well. And that is, if the Voice wants to go off and advise about parking tickets and submarines, the Aboriginal people in the local and regional communities that are choosing people are going to say, hang on, you were supposed to help us close the gap in education, in employment, in healthcare and housing, and you've been mucking around over there in Canberra, dealing with parking tickets and submarines. What sort of planet are you on? And they will dispense with the members in the way they dispense with members of Parliament who aren't focused on the job of serving their communities. So there's the democratic check. The secondary check is that because the Parliament retains power, the Parliament can determine how we will receive the representations, what the priorities of the representations will be. Linda Burney's already been very clear that, her priorities as the Minister for Indigenous Australians will be to have the Voice focused on education, employment, healthcare and housing, closing the gap in the four of those areas. Now that's not the work of a weekend. I mean, that is going to be serious work that will take a lot of the time and energy of the Voice. That's, a couple of years worth of work there. So I think it will be a body that operates seriously. I think it'll be a body that we as the Parliament can set processes to ensure that it stays on track in relation to its function, and it will also have, as it were, the check of the people that choose it to say, we sent you there to fix X and you've run amok. No thanks, we'll choose someone else.
Tim, you wrote an excellent article examining the yes-no pamphlet, and I'm sure you can find that article on the internet. It's one of the clearest dissections of what is in this pamphlet, but also you point to the issue that Julian has just raised. It seems crazy that this doesn't make very clear that Parliament will be able to shape the voice to be entirely to the satisfaction of the politicians.
Yes, I was frankly disappointed by the way that the Yes case was stated in the pamphlet issued by the Australian Electoral Commission, because it left out a really important point, the point that both Geoff and Julian have just alluded to. That is, that the Parliament, let's say that the referendum is passed, the Parliament will then sit down and do a lot of consultation with Indigenous and other Australians about the design of the voice. There will be parliamentary debate, there will be amendments moved, especially in the Senate, and eventually a bill will emerge which will, as well as any process could, establish the consensus Australian view about the design of the voice. Now, the Yes pamphlet allowed those who wrote the No pamphlet to say, or to imply, that if the vote was carried, that is, if the referendum was carried and we had a voice, it would create a body that we would be stuck with forever. The Yes case did not answer that point by saying, no, the Parliament will always have the prerogative to design and redesign the voice. If we're going to have the voice forever in the Constitution, you can bet your life that as long as Australia has a political system, there will be moments of legislative reflection on the adequacy of a particular design that we have at that time, and there will be redesign of the voice. So I don't know why those who wrote the Yes pamphlet omitted to make such an important point, and I'm very happy to have the opportunity to make it here now.
The most important point is that in that pamphlet you don't really get the evidence for how the referendum, in recognising and listening through the voice, would actually address the very serious things that afflict particularly remote communities, but Western Sydney from Campbelltown to Edmonton and Mount Druitt has the largest enclave of First Peoples in this country, and many of the educators and the Aboriginal health people that I've known and worked with for decades say, don't think that there's a discrepancy in all those horrid statistics. My own personal experience to share with you is, I passionately believe that the key to the change is the advice from the grassroots and the Aboriginal peak bodies and community-controlled organisations that have been not only dismantled and underfunded, they have been tragically ignored when they hold the key to the change. Those communities cannot be empowered until we heed the advice. Last week, I worked on a hopeful gathering of the peak bodies that are trying to stop the removal of Aboriginal children from their families. I personally have not come across anything that is so clear an example of why we must change the way that we are governing the country, than to think that we have today the removal of children from their families at a rate that, if this pattern continues, will outstrip the historic stolen generation. Grandmothers Against Removal is the kind of grassroots wisdom and experience that is urging government, and the new New South Wales government gathered these bodies in to hear once more what those grandmothers have been trying to convince government to do. They pointed out that here in New South Wales, we have 6,509 Aboriginal children plucked out of their families. We still have babies taken away from young mothers who don't get to put the babe onto their breast to suckle and bond, that don't have a photograph before the baby is taken away. Yes, in the 21st century, we're still doing it. We've apologised for it, but we haven't listened to that crucial advice. So if you want evidence for why we must change and why we need to say yes, think of any Aboriginal child born this year. Those that are removed from their families would be very lucky to be reunited with them before they're in their middle teenage years. Only a couple of hundred here in New South Wales have been restored to family, as the government jargon describes it. Put yourselves in the shoes of any one of those mothers and fathers. As a parent myself, it brings tears to my eyes to even think about it, let alone to sit with the grandmothers and they say, will another report, will another government inquiry, will another government promise to change, really change what they are doing? And you know that a very high percentage of those children removed from their families will end up in a juvenile court, and then a high percentage of those children in juvenile justice will go on to stand as adults, and they will be the pattern that gives us the horrific over-incarceration rate of our First Peoples. That is the evidence, and it is in there in every government report that is put out annually about these deep-seated cross-generational problems, and the solution in every case is to heed the wisdom. It is not shallow advice. It comes from the painful, tragic experience of people who try to put their lives back together despite the oppressiveness of the policy. There are many other examples, and I would like, Julian, if you would, to share what you've learned in government and in those many years before, when you wrote about this, before you were a Member of Parliament. I should point that out, that this man was on this road before he was in a political party. He was advocating for recognition, seeing the importance of acknowledging that, of saying you are human beings, because I know from your work you believe it will make a positive, practical difference to human beings.
Thanks, Geoff. My involvement in this goes back to 1998 when I was a delegate at the Constitutional Convention for the last referendum, where I moved that we have a second question alongside the Republic referendum to recognise Aboriginal people in the Constitution. And in fact, the most important committee that I served on at that convention was a committee that combined people who were both monarchists and Republicans and all the Indigenous delegates, of which there was a unanimous consensus that we should have this question. So, you know, this has been a long time coming, and as I say, it goes back to the 1930s. But there's plenty of evidence that when you listen to Indigenous people, you get a better result. I gave the example the other day of the Victorian Aboriginal Community-Controlled Health Organisation. We have in Australia very high rates of breast cancer among both Indigenous and non-Indigenous women. The rates are about the same, but the rates of survival from breast cancer are so much higher for non-Indigenous women than Indigenous women. And the Victorian Aboriginal Controlled Health Organisation tried to work out why was this so. So they convened round tables of Indigenous women and they listened to what they had to say. They said, there's a confronting institutionalised space of going to a public hospital for a screen. It doesn't feel like a culturally appropriate space for us. And there were concerns about modesty. So they came up with a program called the Beautiful Shawl Program, where they designed Indigenous shawls with motifs on them that they gave to women who were getting screened, and they had mobile screening units going into community. The rates of screening massively increased. You can't stop breast cancer if you're not being screened. This was a small change that was made in order to deliver a better result that came from listening to people. Another example, I chaired in the last Parliament, the House of Representatives Committee on Indigenous Affairs. A couple of examples from this. We did an inquiry into food security in remote communities. Much of the fruit and vegetables that is sent to communities in the north of Australia is grown in the south of Australia. It takes a long time to get there, refrigeration is an issue, and when it gets there, refrigeration in communities is inadequate. So a Canberra Knows Best solution says, let's send a bunch of fridges to remote communities and increase the refrigeration. That sounds like a sensible idea if you're sitting in Canberra. Until you get to the remote communities and you realise that the electricity supply is completely intermittent, and so you can send all the fridges in the world, but nothing will be kept cool and nothing will be kept frozen because the electricity supply is unreliable. That's the sort of information you get from being on the ground. Another really good example in the current, in terms of current issues before the Minister, where I think the Voice will really benefit. The government runs a thing called the Community Development Program. It's been roundly criticised. It's a remote area employment program, largely but not exclusively dealing with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This program has to operate very differently in labour markets which are a reasonable transport distance away, in communities which are a reasonable transport distance away from a labour market where there are jobs in the general economy, from a community that is completely isolated. And you need a different sort of program in those places for the program to be successful. Listening to Indigenous people in community means that you're more likely to get participation that helps build those communities or helps give people skills that are transferable into the general economy if you've adapted the program accordingly. So there's just some examples of where listening makes a real difference. Where we failed, and there's plenty of examples like this. A woman at a meeting in my own electorate who used to work for the Commonwealth Department of Indigenous Affairs told me a story of building houses in a remote community. They went and they did the concrete slab pour, they left their tools and went to the camp the next night. The following day, everything was wrecked. Slabs were wrecked, the tools had been broken. And the officials from the Department of Aboriginal Affairs said, "We came to build houses, why have you done this?" And the Indigenous elders said, "You built the houses on our burial grounds." That's what happens when you don't listen to people, when you take a Canberra Knows Best attitude. Imagine if they built houses on Rookwood, how people would feel. That's what was being done here. So listening to people to get better results, actually, it makes such good sense. It's surprising we haven't done it already. What we're doing here is saying to Parliament, enough of the closed ears. We're inviting you, as the Australian people, to set us up a new process that will save us money. This might be the last example. One of the things that the Uluru statement talks about is, the Aboriginal people are not a criminal people, but they're the most incarcerated people on the planet. And one of the sad statistics we know is that it costs more money to send, that an Aboriginal male is more likely to end up in jail than in university. The average cost to the Australian taxpayer of sending a student to university, an average course is $11,000. The cost to put a person in jail is $148,000. If they're a juvenile, it's $1 million a year. If somebody goes to university and they complete their degree and they get a job, we've closed the gap. It's the best thing we know in terms of closing the gap, in terms of income and opportunities. So I believe, done properly, the Voice will save the taxpayer money and will be life-changing on the ground for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. For most of us, and this is one of the sad things about the no case, who think this will be the end of Australia as we know it, won't actually affect us. This will have a positive benefit for Aboriginal people, it will have a positive benefit for the public service, it will have a positive benefit for parliamentarians. And it will have a positive benefit on our national psyche because, as Geoff said, we'll be a more united nation because that gap will be closed. We'll be on the road to closing that gap. That's the important thing here.
An example. Building on your positive list, Julian, I recall that the Productivity Commission highlighted the failure of government to heed the advice about the bail laws on Aboriginal children who'd be brought before a court, taken in by the police on very minor things, and then actually put into a cell, children put into a cell because of the bail laws. And this is the kind of life-changing experience for a child. I mean, I remind you that there are parts of Australia where 10 and 12-year-old Aboriginal children are being sent to jail. We have not heeded the advice, not only from Aboriginal grassroots communities, we have not heeded the advice of the law reform councils, of some of the best scholars and lawyers in the country have said this has to change. We've been so slow. So some states are looking at raising it to 12. The advice has been it should be 14. But if you come back to the community level and see that children, as Julian says, that need support in their infancy, that need preschooling, that need preparation for school, the promise of preschooling for every 4-year-old is not a reality in remote Aboriginal communities. And the underfunding of education in the isolated, crisis-afflicted areas is really just fueling this process where children who, if they learned the power of education through their infancy and then came into school prepared for learning and had their natural Aboriginal cultural sense of discipline and responsibility, you would start to see a whole child instead of a broken and damaged child, which I see over and over again in these settings. If we don't listen, that pattern will continue. If we jail children, you criminalise the population, and that devastating line that Julian shared from the Uluru statement, that is the powerlessness, that is the torment. It is because Aboriginal people themselves are watching this happen and are powerless in this situation to be able to stop this happening. That is what cross-generational suffering does. It gets to a point that I've only ever seen elsewhere in a war zone and a refugee situation, where powerlessness becomes helplessness, and it's tragic, and we have no excuse for that. Our fourth world poverty is our responsibility. All of these children are our responsibility. So when we come back to the practical, I keep saying, think of the child. If you do, there is no choice. The no choice is a vote for nothing. There is not a single line that I have read or listened to after many, many hours of patiently listening to those that try to find a problem with the constructive proposition. There is no offering from no. It just keeps us wallowing in what is very much a broken system. Tim, I like your hopefulness and your positivity and the generational wave that you see coming in. I too have worked closely with groups like the first Aboriginal doctors. I knew the first Aboriginal doctor, a psychologist. I knew the first Aboriginal nurse personally. I can't tell you how much hope that gives me and my family, and watching those people flood into every area. And we celebrate them around the world. People like Rachel Perkins, who is championing the yes vote in this campaign. The film work, the dance, the music, the sport, every area of life, the philosophy, the way of being, of what it is to be here. They've given us language to know what it is to be truly Australian. That was the gift that my children grew up listening and experiencing with Aboriginal people. Tim, what makes you hopeful that out of this year, which so far has been very rocky for a lot of the First People, it's difficult, we're in another season of difficult politics, but can you see us hopefully uniting?
and giving the world something to look at us in a better light. I don't see us uniting, and I don't think it matters, because what I'm looking for and hoping for is a victory for the Yes campaign. If it's 51%, I'll take that. Those who campaign for no, the next day, when they contemplate their failure, will have to ask themselves how to interpret that result. And in a way, you've touched on one of the thoughts that is irrepressibly going to come to their mind, and that is that they are offering nothing. And I think people can see what's wrong with negativity. They can see what's wrong with offering nothing to an Australian population that is fair-minded and idealistic, but sometimes bewildered about how to deal with complex problems. So when someone comes along, when the Indigenous community presents us with a solution which is modest but practical, and we don't take it, it's a betrayal of the sense of fair play, the sense of hopefulness, the creativity and resourcefulness of the Australian people. So one of the things that makes me hopeful is that although the polls have been trending against no over the last few months, what the polls have also been showing is that a high proportion of the voting public has not yet made up its mind. A lot of people are engaging with this issue late. Julian has been engaging with it for a long time. I've been engaging with it for a long time. Geoff, you've been engaging with it for a long time. What we have to remember, that a lot of people are going to be engaging with it over the next few weeks. And what we have to continue to point out to them is that it's better to have a solution than to have a pathetic slogan like, if you don't know, vote no. That is really the most hopeless. I think people can see that it's hopeless. Some people shouted triumphantly. I saw it on TV the other day at a meeting in Western Australia where people were flourishing that slogan as if it was a kind of something to be proud of. But Australians are not proud of being ignorant or of being lacking idealism or lacking creativity. They're not going to rejoice in the victory of a no campaign that simply dwells on our ignorance.
Before we go on with more, are there important questions you would like to ask, and we'd be happy to try and tackle them?
Geoff, I'm just curious from the perspective of the Yes campaign how it's going to mobilise against the general feeling that I'm getting that this is an opportunity for the right side of politics to put a stick in Albanese's eye rather than focus on the real issue, and that is of First Nations people. The politicisation and the partisanship that I've seen, where in the Saturday paper there were Liberal Party politicians quoted and texting each other saying, we've got to beat this because this is the way we win the next federal election. It's got nothing to do with First Nations people. It's got everything to do with putting a stick in Albanese and Labor's eye. What's the Yes campaign's view of how we might combat that partisanship so that we can get to the crux of the issue, which is First Nations people, not Labor against the LNP?
Well, can I, as the parliamentarian on the panel, can I answer that question? The first thing to say is that no human being is on the ballot paper of the referendum. Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton are not on the ballot paper. I'm not on the ballot paper. Aboriginal people themselves are not on the ballot paper. There's only this amendment and that question. We've got to take the debate back to this amendment and that question, because it is in the interest of the No campaign to talk about anything and everything except this amendment and that question. What gives me great heart is the fact that there are thousands of people signing up to help out with the Yes campaign right across the country every day. 25,000 people were door knocking at the weekend, which is for people who are talking to their Liberal voting friends to say, actually, this is not a Liberal-Labor contest. Here's a bunch of Liberals that are voting yes, and this isn't about Albanese. I mean, I am looking forward to the defeat of the Albanese government, and I will work, you know, with every fibre of my being for the defeat of the Albanese government, because I think it's a bad government. But this has nothing to do with whether the Albanese government is a good or a bad government. This is about whether we change our constitution to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and to create a mechanism in there so we can better listen to them.
I guess I would respectfully reject your assertion because the Murdochracy and the Fairfax Press would vote otherwise, and they are supporting Dutton strongly, and it's very partisan. The Fourth Estate is not behind the Yes campaign. It's just not.
The media is another problem altogether.
You bet.
They're reporting this as conflict, as a horse race, as if it's the Melbourne Cup, fixated on the polling, and the attention has not been paid to not only those that Julian mentioned, but why has Julie Bishop taken the same standard principle that Julian Lees has? I mean, I have to say this, I can disagree with many things for hours with Julian about various things in politics, but we've got to come back to the common ground and recognise the media is not interested in that. Stan Grant has pointed that out. The media's attitude to this is to go to the attention-grabbing conflict, whereas what we're really getting from seeing today a photograph of Penny Wong alongside Julie Bishop and one more, Dean Parkin of the Yes campaign, walking the streets of Perth. And I thought, the media told us some weeks back that that was the end of Julian made her intervention, said a little piece, and then she was going off. They were, in a shallow way, dismissing her thoughtful, principled stand. So if those Liberals do campaign, it's in a way all we can ask of an individual. Of a political party, we have every right to point out the double standards, that if Julian's party is prepared to have some form of legislative voice, whether it's national or regional or whatever, it seems illogical that the only problem is putting it in the Constitution, and then Parliament in both cases makes all of the design and controls funding, and as Tim and Julian have stressed, has a great deal of influence over the future. That's different. I think we have to try to, in the media case, use outlets like Media Watch. Get on to Paul Barry and let them know that you're unhappy about the way this has been generally trivialised, and certainly the misreading of the importance of this opportunity. You can't cover something this important to the nation as if it's the Melbourne Cup and just a contest. This is about life or death for First People, and we have not in the media seen that seriousness, and we have not seen the hope, the opportunity expressed by the media.
So if I had hair, it would be very grey. So those people in this room have grey hair. What's happening with the young people? They're not in meetings like this. Is this the social media disconnect from my generation?
Young people are close, between 80 and 90% of the polls show they are the ones that have the education. They are part of what Tim spoke to. They are the sector of Australian society that is leading us older people to the common sense of listening to the advice, because they say the system's broken. Worse than that, it's rigged. Fix it. What have the baby boomers done? So it is actually part of the polling that is quite fascinating, that women are more thoughtful than men about these issues. A large block of undecideds, as both Julian and Tim have said, but the youthful interest in this, I'm certain, comes from their improved education. Because you know, when we were in school and even in university, you did not have accurate history, and thanks to people like Tim and colleagues, that has changed enormously over the last 50 years. So young people today, the university-educated people, have a serious grasp of this, having gone to discussions at universities. There is a fine understanding. It's more the dogged refusal to even consider that we can change at all. It's our innate conservatism about change, of our generational obstinacy, I think, that is the problem.
I know the Yes booklet has been widely criticised tonight, the Yes and No booklet, but at the beginning of the the Yes argument in that booklet is a very simple proposition that summarises what this is all about. It's our chance to recognise Indigenous people in the Constitution. It's a chance to create a new body, a new committee called The Voice, to allow the Parliament to listen to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to achieve better outcomes in education, employment, healthcare and housing. That's your elevator pitch. I think it's a strong elevator pitch. And that's the best way of explaining this to people.
No, absolutely.
If you want to impress, vote yes.
But there are a lot of things in life you can't distill to a bumper sticker. You know that. The media has highlighted the negativity because it's drawn to it, and some of those infuriating things, like if you don't know, vote no, have actually been, they're like earworms. So I can understand you thinking, well, where is Philip Adams today with that advertising savvy? Unfortunately, a lot of those people now are so jaundiced about the media's role generally that we all look with suspicion at television advertising. We know we're being lied to, and I mentioned at the outset, the AEC can't really fact-check this document. We're relying on the political process to put forward arguments in good faith. No, 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 no is what Aboriginal people have been hearing all of their lives. So the no, 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 you can't do this, you can't do that. Your start where you ask what's happened about treaty is not in the offering, it is not in the question. That doesn't mean it's out of question, as some of the media are saying. It means, as Megan Davis has said, this referendum is about recognition of the First People. It is about a voice to Parliament. We have an opportunity to do something together. We can't be really detoured by a longer list of hopeful things that aren't on the table. We didn't decide what was on the table. The process of dialogue that arrived at this, that has gone on now for a couple of decades, gave us this opportunity. If we don't act now in a practical way and make the change, children, families, and then generations will suffer as a consequence of us not taking up this opportunity.